Good to see everyone tonight. I thought we would do something a little different to start tonight because we haven't just gone through the 17 Bible time periods recently. So let's just see if we can recall that. That's the basis of everything we're doing. And if we don't remember the 17 Bible time periods, the rest of it doesn't do us a whole lot of good. So I would like to see your hand motions. I would like to see the kiddos that are around if they're going to participate with us, and adults too. But I'd like for us just to run through the 17 Bible time periods and make sure that those are nice and fresh in our minds. So I'm going to get you started, and then I'm just going to sit back and let you go with it. All right. Are y'all ready? All right. The first Bible time period, the first 5 chapters of the book of Genesis, we're talking about creation and Adam and Eve and the first sin, the story of Cain and Abel and Seth. All of that happens
before the flood.
Before the flood. Go with it.
The flood. Scattering of the people.
The
Patriarchs. Exodus. Wandering in the wilderness. Invasion and conquest of land. Judges. United Kingdom. Divided Kingdom.
Judah alone.
Captivity. Return from captivity.
Judah.
400 years of silence.
The life of Christ.
Early church. Letters to the Christians.
Very good. I at least know that Vicky knows them because she was the one voice that I heard more than anybody else. The rest of y'all were just riding on her coattails tonight. All right. So good. Again, the 17 Bible time periods are the foundation of everything. So if all you remember from this study are those 17 Bible time periods, you can tell the story of the Bible, and that's really important. So the next thing that I thought we would do tonight is just see how much we remember about the scriptures that go with each Bible time period. So I thought that I would give you some scripture references. I will give you a book of the Bible, and if necessary, a chapter of the Bible, and you tell me where it fits in the 17 Bible time periods. So let's just see how we do with that. And we'll do it as a group. We won't put anybody on the spot by themselves tonight. So how about the book of Ezra?
Judges?
No, not Judges.
Is return from captivity.
Return from captivity. Good. All right. 1 Kings chapter 12.
Divided Kingdom.
Divided Kingdom. Good. All right. 1 Samuel chapter 8.
Judges.
At the end of Judges. Good. Very good. All right. Genesis chapter 11.
Flood?
Scattering
No,
of the
after the
people.
flood, yeah.
Scattering. That's right. That's right after the flood. Who can tell me the chapters that go with the flood?
6 through 10.
6 through 10. That's right. 6 through 10. Let's see. How about the book of Deuteronomy?
Crickets. Wandering in the wilderness.
Wandering in the wilderness. Good. Wandering in the wilderness. Joshua chapter 6.
Invasion and conquest.
Start an invasion and conquest. That's right. All right. So what chapters in Joshua go with wandering in the wilderness?
First
1 through 5. That's right. All right. The book of Exodus.
The Exodus.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
That was supposed to be an easy one. Okay. Let's see. What haven't I asked about? What about Genesis chapter 37?
Patriarch.
Patriarch. Bonus points if you can tell me whose story kind of takes center stage starting in Genesis 37.
Joseph.
Joseph, that's right. All right. The book of Acts.
Early church.
The early church. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Life of Christ.
Christ.
Life of Christ. The book of Ruth.
Judges.
Good. The book of Esther. Return from captivity. Return from captivity. All right, good. All right, so let's take a couple of minutes tonight to just briefly review where we are in our study, filling in some details. All right, so we summarize the United Kingdom just by the 3 kings of the United Kingdom, Saul, David, and Solomon. And that then brings us to the period of the divided kingdom. So without looking at your notes, what can you tell me about the period of the divided kingdom?
Israel and Judah.
Oops. Sorry about that. I just lost my...
Israel and Judah.
All right. Israel and Judah. Allie, which one is which? North and south?
Israel's north, Judah is south.
All right. Good. So we've got the kingdom of Israel in the north and the kingdom of Judah in the south. Good. All right. And what else can you tell me about this Bible time period?
The period last 100 years until Israel was taken away.
Good. All right. So 200 years until Israel is taken away into captivity. Bonus points if somebody can tell me who took them away into captivity.
The Assyrians.
Ah, somebody was listening. Okay, good. The Assyrians took them away into captivity, and mucho bonus points. I'm talking like a bucket load of bonus points if you can tell me the year that happened.
900.
Nope. All right. Starts with a 7.
7.
722 BC. And the only reason that date is important is just because it gives us a reference point to what's coming next. All right. Who can tell me the major prophet whose work began during the divided kingdom? It continued into the time of Judah alone. Isaiah. All right. And who can tell me the minor prophets of the divided kingdom?
Obadiah.
All right, that's one of them.
Joel.
Micah.
Joel,
Amos.
Amos,
Hosea.
Hosea,
Micah.
Micah, Jonah. Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, the first 6. So the first 6 minor prophets and Isaiah. As we said, Isaiah continues into the time of Judah alone. All right. When we talk about the period of Judah alone, there are 3 kings that we specifically highlighted during this time. They're kind of the most important, really, of the kings of the time of Judah alone. What 3 kings? 2 of them good and 1 of them not.
Josiah.
Yeah,
Josiah.
and Josiah.
All right, I heard Hezekiah and Josiah. Who was the other one?
Manasseh.
Manasseh. Hezekiah, Manasseh, and Josiah. All right. Isaiah started in the time of the divided kingdom and continued into the time of Judah alone. What other major prophet fits into the time of Judah alone? Jeremiah. That's right, Jeremiah. And what minor prophets fit into the time of Judah alone?
Nahum.
Nahum, Habakkuk, and
Zephaniah.
Zephaniah. That's right. The next 3 of the minor prophets. So Jeremiah is the major prophet. Again, Isaiah also, but Jeremiah, which includes Lamentations, and then Nahum, Habakkuk, and Zephaniah. All right. That brings us to what's our next Bible time period after Judah alone? Captivity. That's right. The period of the captivity. And in this, we just included the 2 major prophets that are connected with the captivity. Who are they?
Daniel and Ezekiel.
Daniel and Ezekiel. That is correct. All right. So that brings us then to where we left off last week, talking about the return from captivity. And the books that we list here in connection with the return are listed there in pretty much chronological order. There is some interweaving of these books that we'll talk about here in just a moment. But Ezra, Haggai, Zechariah, Esther, Nehemiah, and Malachi, that's pretty much the chronological order if you were just putting them in order of the date they begin. All right. So the story of the return from captivity is about 3 returns. All right, 3 returns. So it didn't happen all at once, but basically 3. And then there's one other story that's inserted in the middle of that. So there are 2 names, who led the first return of captives from captivity back to the city of Jerusalem? 2 names that led the return.
Ezra.
Before Ezra,
Nehemiah.
we're going to get to those 2 in a minute. But the first return, there's 2 names.
Zerubbabel.
Zerubbabel is one, and
Yeshua.
Jeshua. That's right. Zerubbabel and Jeshua. And their focus was on rebuilding the temple. That was the focus of Zerubbabel and Jeshua. Now, their story is the first part of the book of Ezra. There is another story that fits between Ezra chapter 6 and 7. What story is that?
And Esther.
It's the story of Esther. Esther fits between Ezra chapter 6 and 7. Then we have the second return of captives back to the city of Jerusalem. And the second return was led by who? Ezra, that's right. And Ezra's focus was on purifying the worship. So you got the temple built, now let's get the worship right. That was the focus of Ezra. And then the third and final return was led by who?
It was Nehemiah.
Nehemiah. And the focus of Nehemiah was on the reconstruction of the walls of the city of Jerusalem. What I want to do tonight is to fill in a few details about this period. And if you don't remember all of the details of this, that's okay. But I want to flesh this out and fill in a few gaps in this Bible time period. So we talked first about Zerubbabel in about the year 536, 536 BC. How many years after the captivity did the return happen? How many years
70.
were they captive?
70.
70 years. That's exactly right. And so, remember I said that we talk about dates. So Assyria took Israel, the northern kingdom, captive in 722. Babylon, we talked a little bit about this morning. Babylon first began to try to take the city of Jerusalem in 606 BC. So a little more than 100 years of Judah alone. 606 BC. And then Jerusalem and they carried away the first wave of captives in 606. Jerusalem finally fell to the Babylonians in 586 BC. 586 BC. But Zerubbabel in about 536, so 70 years after the first captives were taken, Zerubbabel, along with Jeshua, who was the high priest, and around 50,000 Jews came back to the city of Jerusalem. And it's during this time that you have the prophets Haggai and Zechariah. And we'll say more in just a moment about how they fit into this story. The Jews came back to the city of Jerusalem and started rebuilding the temple. But after a year, construction of the temple stopped. Well, how did that happen? Does anybody remember the name of the king who allowed the Jews to return to Jerusalem, who set the captives free?
Cyrus?
That's right, King Cyrus. After Cyrus died, the enemies of the Jews came to the next king, Cambyses, and complained about the construction of Jerusalem. And it was King Cambyses that ordered the building of the temple stopped. And that's where the prophets Haggai and Zechariah come into the picture, because they came on the sea to stir up the people to finish the reconstruction of the temple between 520 and 516 BC. And so there was so you had the construction started. About a year into it, it came to a stop, and God sent Haggai and Zechariah to stir up the people to finish the job of rebuilding the temple. As we already mentioned, Esther fits here in between Ezra chapter 6 and 7, about the year 485 BC. Ezra leads the second return of Jewish captives, 458 BC. And as we've already mentioned, he concentrates on purifying temple worship. Now, here's why that's important. One of the reasons that Judah was carried away into captivity, one of the reasons that God punished them was for their idolatry. And so you have people with the background of idolatry. That's not to say that they had completely abandoned the worship of the Lord, but they had contaminated it with idolatry. For 70 years, those people have been carried away into captivity, away from the temple. In fact, the temple had been destroyed, out of their homeland, in a foreign land, a land that is permeated with idolatry. So when these people come back, they rebuild the temple. What's to keep them from filling the temple with idols or worshiping in the temple and worshiping idols at the same time? Ezra wants to make sure that they don't fall into that same category or that same problem again. Now, eventually, the children of Israel, between the time of the return from captivity and the time that Jesus arrived on the scene, they had all kinds of problems. But was idolatry one of them? Not in the classic sense of graven images, of false gods and goddesses. They had seemed to have pretty well learned that lesson from their captivity. Ezra concentrates on purifying worship. Nehemiah comes in about 445 BC to build the walls of Jerusalem. And the last prophet of the Old Testament, Malachi, appears on the scene about 432 BC. All right, so let's talk about let's recap the big points that we need to remember. The first return under Zerubbabel and Jeshua, the work of Haggai and Zechariah, the story of Esther, the return that Ezra led, the return that Nehemiah led. So those are the names that you need to remember. Zerubbabel and Jeshua, Haggai and Zechariah, Esther, Ezra, Nehemiah. And those names will help you to recall the story of the return from captivity. All right, any questions about that?
Can you read the last two bullet points? I can't see them because you're over. And I don't know if it's that way for everybody else, but
Yeah, I can see him here.
okay.
The very last two about Nehemiah and Malachi.
Yeah. Okay. I just figured out how to get it. Never mind.
Okay. All right. Anybody else? What you all see on your end is different than what I'm seeing, so I never know exactly. All right. All right. Let's talk about the. Let's talk about the years of silence for a moment, because we get into a period where we're filling in some gaps without having the Bible record to do that. We're dependent upon world history and some other some what are called apocryphal books of the Bible. That is, they're not inspired books that aren't in the Bible. They're part of what's called the Apocrypha, to fill in some gaps. So how do we go from this, the Medo-Persian Empire, that is the empire that overtook the Babylonians and allowed the Jews to return to Jerusalem? How do we go from that to Syria and Egypt fighting over the territory of Judea, to the divisions of Galilee, Samaria, and Judea, and the rise of the Roman Empire, to kind of the divisions of this region that we read about in the days of Jesus. I put those maps up there just to show you, to illustrate for you the changes that took place over the 400-year period of silence. All of those different phases, geographic and political phases, all fit into the 400 years of silence. So let's put this in the terms of bullet points. The Persian Empire reigned at the time that the Jews were returned to Jerusalem. And so during the years of silence, you have the fall of the Persian Empire. While it was in place up through the end of the Old Testament, the Persian Empire ultimately fell. It's in its place the Grecian Empire. The Grecian Empire rose to prominence. But over time, the Grecian Empire began to splinter. Does anybody remember from world civilization class or world history class anything about the Grecian Empire? How was the Grecian Empire held together?
Alexander the Great did it, and then he died, and his 4 sons or soldiers or generals or something took over, didn't they?
Right. So you have those great big characters that kind of held it all together, but then as one passed to the next, you would have the division of the kingdom. It was also composed of what were called city-states. In other words, there was a certain level of autonomy or independence that you had in different places. So you would have a major city and kind of its suburbs and the land around it, and that city state had some degree of independence. And so you had kind of this loose conglomeration of geography that composed the kingdom as a whole. Well, you can see how over time that would begin to splinter, allegiances would be divided, and so forth. You have a period in which the Seleucid Empire, which is Syria and Mesopotamia, battled for control of Palestine, that is the region of Judea, Galilee, Samaria, etc. Battled Egypt or the Ptolemaic kingdom for control. And so that was one of the maps that I put up there. You have the Maccabean Revolt, which is, you might have heard of First and Second Maccabees. Those are actually a couple of those apocryphal books that are sometimes referenced. The Maccabean Revolt was the result of the Jewish Maccabees against these outside influences. During that time, you have the development of different parties among the Jews, Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes, just among some of them. And then ultimately, Rome comes to the Eastern Mediterranean region, which includes Palestine. Herod the Great, who was actually, in some ways, a holdover of the Greek influence, was given the kingdom of Judea that included virtually all of Palestine. And so during the years of silence, you have these geographic and political and military forces moving steadily. And so how do you go from the Persians at the time of the return and through the end of the Old Testament to the Jewish powers that are in place when we open the pages of the New Testament? Well, this is a very short an overly simplified outline of that transition that took place. Now, here's my question for you. Why is that important? Well, number one, it gives you a sense of the geopolitical situation that you're arriving on when you get to the pages of the New Testament. In other words, Bible history doesn't happen in a world vacuum. It is interwoven with world history. And so you just kind of see how that developed. You open the pages of the New Testament and you read about synagogues and you read about Pharisees and Sadducees. We don't read about those things during the Old Testament. Where'd they come from? Well, they developed during this time period. But it's also relevant to the fulfillment of Bible prophecy. And so particularly this relates to the prophet Daniel, who prophesied of the great and permanent kingdom that was going to come in the days of a fourth world empire. Well, he said, "You, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, are the head of gold." Do you remember? And there's going to come another in silver and another in bronze and another in iron and iron mixed with clay. Well, you can trace that from Babylon forward through this world history, from the Babylonians to the Persians to the Greeks and then to the Romans. And in the days of that fourth world empire, in the days of the Romans, then there was going to be this kingdom, not made of human hands, that stone cut without hands, without human hands, that becomes a mountain and fills the whole earth. Well, it's a prophecy of the Messianic kingdom, and it tells us when it's coming. And we can take that prophecy and line it up with world history and see exactly where that fits. And so to have some idea of what was going on in the world during that 400 years of silence is helpful. Does that make sense? Does everybody follow that? Does everybody see how that works? Anybody have any questions about that?
I think another little extension of that might be that the phrase that's used in the fullness of time.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's used in fulfillment of the prophecy of Christ to come and be crucified in the fullness of time. And I mean, there's probably a lot more to that we'll never understand or know in the mind of God. But we can see, like you said, from a political and geographical standpoint, some of the things that came to place that play into that.
Right. So Romans chapter 5 talks about at the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. Paul in the book of Galatians uses that expression Laura mentioned, in the fullness of time. And, you know, someone has numbered 332, I believe it is, specific messianic prophecies in the Old Testament. I haven't tried to verify that number. But you have all of this prophetic working up toward, well, at the end of the Old Testament with the book of Malachi, you've got the people in one place and you've got them in a different place at the opening of the New Testament. And these things help us to understand how we get from point A to point B. All right. Well, we've got a few minutes left, but I don't really want to dive into our next Bible time period tonight. I'd like to just put a pin in it for there, and then we can jump into the New Testament, Lord willing, next Sunday night. I want to show you something, and and I don't want this to discourage you from taking notes, because in taking notes, you're learning it, you're writing it down, you're remembering it. But someone asked if you might be able to have something to kind of as a quick reference guide for all of these things. Well, I want to show you I'm working on it. And so I'm trying to get all of the text in there and try to put it into a format that will be usable for you, but still readable. That's a little challenging. But we're going to try to condense all of that down. And then before we get into kind of the final phase of this study, I'll have that in your hand. And then as we go back through things and add a few details, you'll be able to make your own notes that help you. We're going to be putting some chapters with some specific bullet points, again, just as a part of having a good quick reference structure. So I wanted to show you that it is in process. I haven't forgotten about that. And hopefully that's a tool that you'll have that you can add to your Bible at some point in the future. All right. Anybody have any questions, comments, observations, complaints, or criticisms before we sign off for the night?
What are we doing Wednesday?
Oh, Wednesday, we are going to, so the next 2 Wednesdays, we're going to go through, we're going to look at the Beatitudes, the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount. That was suggested, and we're going to spend a couple of Wednesday nights looking at the Beatitudes. And I'm glad you said that. So obviously read it and be thinking about and brainstorming, and I'll send something out about this if I don't forget. Be thinking about application. What does that really mean? What does that look like in a practical way as we talk about these individual things? So yeah, Wednesday night, 7 o'clock, Lord willing. All right. That's it for tonight. Good night, everybody. Thank you for joining us to study, and Lord willing, see you online Wednesday and in person next Sunday. Good night, everybody. Have a great week.
All right.
Good night.